We have a saying in churchland, those of us who work in it, that God's timing is not our timing. It's a very frustrating phrase, actually, when you think about it, because we want to know. That's part of human nature, is that we want to know what's going on, when things will happen, when we can prepare for events happening. In our reading today, we hear from Jesus that we can't know, we can't plan. More frustration. So, welcome to Mark's uh, chapter known as the Mini Apocalypse, talking about the destruction that was going to be facing the people who lived in Jerusalem. Now, one of the interesting historical parts of this is that this story of the destruction of the temple is one of the ways they actually date the Gospel of Mark and Matthew and Luke, because Matthew and Luke's is much more full of the destruction of the temple and the damage that was done, whereas Mark's quoting Deuteronomy, where it says, "Stone will not be left on stone," which is something that was quoted from the destruction of the first temple. Mark was writing in the late 60s, early 70s, so he wouldn't even have necessarily been aware of the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70. If he was if he didn't know about it at all, it would have been by someone telling a story long after the fact. It would not have been something that he, as a writer, would have naturally included in his writing. So that's kind of an interesting historical thing with this particular scripture. But if you look at further, we're looking through verses 1 to 8. Jesus says very specifically, don't listen to people who talk in terms of knowing what is going to happen, because there's no way of knowing. There's no warning going to happen. Do not listen to people who claim they are me or claim they are the Messiah, who tell you assuredly that they know when the destruction is going to happen, when the second coming is going to happen. They don't know. We don't know. God's timing is not our timing. If you do a really, really quick search through Wikipedia or any Google, you can see that every generation, every century has multiple places where people have predicted the end of the earth. Not all of them Christian, some are other traditions as well. The thing is that people want to know, and Jesus says we can't know. We can't prepare. So, what are we going to do? When we prepare for a trip, we know the time, we know the date, we know the location, we know what clothing we're going to need, we know how long we're going to be, what kind of toiletries we're going to have to take with. We know what our accommodations are probably going to look like. We know how we're going to journey. We can prepare for that. We cannot prepare for the second coming, the end of the world, however you want to phrase that. Part of our human nature, once we don't have that assuredness, is to question, to doubt, to get really worked up of all the symbols around. Is this it? Is this the beginning? Is this the task? Is this the show that is going to make all the difference? And Jesus essentially told his friends, just chill. You're not going to have that information. There's going to be earthquakes and there's going to be famines and there's going to be wars. None of that signifies that this is the beginning of the end. And in the land where they lived, earthquakes were normal. They're on a fault line. Famines were regular. These people did not have the benefit of food storage that we take for granted in the 21st century. They had wars constantly, people vying for land, little bits, big bits. Huge empires rose and fell around them. They were often part of the group conquered. They were certainly never the big war machine that was part of conquering anyone else, regardless of some of the stories in the earlier Hebrew scriptures. They were always at the whims, the political winds around them. They didn't have control, and they wanted it, and they wanted assurances, and it was not going to happen. Jesus essentially tells them, don't look for it, and certainly don't listen for people who say they're me. What Jesus was trying to help them understand is all the preparation we really need for what the end time, the second coming, what that's going to look like. All our preparation is how we live today. This story follows on the heels of looking at the widow's mite and the praying in public that we talked about last week. Jesus said, don't live like that. Don't be boastful. Don't be proud. Don't try to get all sorts of attention. The widow gave everything she had, which is probably not a great idea either. But it's how we live that is going to be the only preparation we need and the only preparation we're going to get. And Jesus says, that uses the image of birth pangs. If anybody has been through labor without drugs, it's excruciating. It's the highest level of pain tolerance known in humanity. Women go through incredible pain, and when it starts, you can't stop it. Jesus uses that image of birth pangs when it starts as what's going on around us. We're not there yet. We haven't gone through the marathon of endurance that childbirth is going to be like, to extend that metaphor. We're just at the veriest beginnings, and we do not know what to expect next, except more difficulty, and more war, and more famine, and more earthquakes, and more flooding, because that's always happening. The world is always moving around. Humans don't really matter much when nature is doing its thing. So do not look to that kind of thing as an example. As for wars, that's people making really bad choices, usually those in power, and exploiting those who have no power. For the Hebrew people, for the early Christian community that Mark would have been writing for, they were very familiar of being pawns in political games. They were under the control of the Romans. They knew their own history. Before the Romans, it was the Greeks. Before the Greeks, it was the Persians. Before the Persians, it was the Babylonians. Before the Babylonians, it was the Assyrians. Before the Assyrians, it was the Canaanites. It goes back on and on and on. They never had political freedom, but it was part of what they wanted, part of what they were expecting the Messiah to bring. Instead, when the Messiah told them what to expect, it was not pleasant. But he also wanted to assure them that hope was coming, that this was going to eventually be the reality, that the second coming was eventually going to be, not in timing that humans could understand, and we weren't even given any hints. But just the assurance of hope was enough, and it's enough for us today. The takeaway is not that we live in a world of destruction. The takeaway is that destruction does not end humanity. Destruction is not God's way of punishing anyone. It happens. It's unpleasant. People won't live through it necessarily. But ultimately, God is in control. These things will eventually work themselves out. The second coming is going to happen. Hope is always a constant. And if you're a people in oppression, hope is the biggest gift you can give. I was reading something not that long ago that said hope is a choice. It's not an emotion. It's not something that comes with optimism. It is a choice. Jesus is telling his people to make the choice to hope, because no matter what bad they hear about, God's promises are consistent, they are true. Not predictable as far as the timeline goes, but very predictable as far as where the end is going to be in the long run.